This video is brought to you by Ground News. As US and Russian officials begin talks in Riyadh about ending the war in Ukraine, there's been renewed speculation about where Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions might lead him next. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, for instance, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia may be preparing an offensive against NATO members as early as next year, and a handful of experts have predicted similar scenarios. So in this video, we're going to look at why it's looking more and more likely that Russia could launch another offensive, either in Ukraine or in the wider region. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed, so lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. During this weekend's Munich Security Conference, Zelensky warned the West that Russia plans to send troops to Belarus under the guise of exercises, which could be a prelude to an attack on NATO countries in the summer of 2025. Hosting military drills in Belarus and using the country as a launch pad was basically the same tactic Putin used for his invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. While Zelensky said that he was unsure as to whether Russia will target Ukraine specifically, he warned that a new offensive is inevitable, with Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic countries potentially being in its sights. Zelensky's warning was followed by a report by Latvian intelligence that Moscow is purposefully developing its capabilities to confront NATO. This comes days after a group of German intelligence officials also warned the Bundestag that Russia could carry out an attack against NATO by the end of the decade, while the Danish Defence Intelligence Service last week claimed that if the war in Ukraine ends soon, in 6 months, Russia would be able to wage a local war with a bordering country like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. Within 2 years, it could launch a regional war in the Baltic Sea region, whilst in 5 years, Russia could be ready to wage a large-scale war. Now, at first glance, this might all sound somewhat implausible. After all, Russia is currently struggling to make minimal gains in eastern Ukraine. Its army is exhausted after 2 years of fighting, and the Russian economy is running dangerously hot. Nonetheless, there are at least 3 reasons that people like Zelensky think this sort of scenario is becoming increasingly likely. First, the prospective peace deal looks like it might be pretty good for Russia. Second, Moscow's intensified hybrid warfare across Europe risks escalation. And third, a weakened NATO undermines Europe's deterrence. Let's start by unpacking how a peace deal that's favourable to Putin increases the chance of another attack. Last week, US President Donald Trump announced that he would open negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin over ways to end the war in Ukraine, blindsiding both Kyiv and Washington's fellow NATO allies in Europe. And now there's growing anxiety that Trump is going to force an unfavourable deal on Ukraine. While details still remain a bit blurry, the US has already appeared to make non-trivial concessions to Putin before negotiations by dismissing Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO and to restore control over land at present occupied by Russia. If the deal was sufficiently favourable to Russia, it could encourage Putin to take another pop at either Ukraine or another of Russia's European neighbours. Similarly, if the deal involves the withdrawal of economic sanctions, Russia would be able to rebuild its economy, assuming oil prices stay relatively high. Second, Moscow has been carrying out an escalating hybrid warfare campaign in Europe, including cyber attacks and attacks on undersea cables. Last year saw a dramatic rise in documented Russian hybrid warfare activities of 44 incidents in 2024, up from just 13 in 2023. A Latvian intelligence agency has argued that these attacks are both a test of the European reaction and ability to prevent such incidents, and part of Russia's military doctrine to prepare for a full-blown conflict with the West. While the European reaction has been relatively muted so far, this hybrid warfare also risks triggering an escalatory spiral that could end in more direct conflict. The third and perhaps most important reason why Russia may be emboldened to strike again is that NATO looks pretty defunct at the moment. Trump has been pretty critical about the fact that many European countries in the alliance haven't been meeting their 2% defence spending target. And during his election campaign last year, Trump said he would encourage Russia to attack any NATO member country that didn't meet its financial obligations. He also said that the US could withdraw from the military alliance if its allies don't pay their way, and that European troops in Ukraine wouldn't be covered by NATO's Article 5 mutual defence clause. This growing uncertainty surrounding the conditions under which the US and other NATO allies would invoke Article 5 undermines NATO's deterrence abilities against Russia, and might encourage Russia to push NATO's limits by, say, carrying out strikes along the Ukraine-Poland border or on NATO troops in Ukraine. This would both give Russia a sense of when exactly Article 5 would come into play, and sow division within NATO by provoking arguments about when Article 5 should come into play. Furthermore, Trump may consider withdrawing some of the approximately 100,000 US troops currently stationed in Europe. During his first term, Trump announced plans to withdraw 12,000 troops from Germany. However, this decision was later reversed after Biden assumed office. Earlier this year, Italian media reported that Trump was considering a 20% reduction of US troops in Europe, potentially involving a withdrawal of around 20,000 personnel. Nonetheless, while all these factors might make another Russian attack more likely, there are still two big reasons Putin will be wary of another invasion. First, despite capturing large swathes of Ukrainian territory, Russia's recent advances in Ukraine have been slow and grueling. While Russia gained Ukrainian territory twice the size of Mauritius in 2024 and has made some gains this month in its advance towards Provosk, it's taken them a long time. If Russia is struggling in eastern Ukraine, it doesn't seem like a good idea to risk yet another war. Second, there's the economy. Extravagant military spending has meant inflation has skyrocketed, rising to 10% in February, despite super steep interest rate hikes by the Russian central bank, and the ruble is now worth less than a cent. It's hard to believe that Russia is financially capable of waging another war anytime soon. This also interacts in uncomfortable ways with Russia's demographic crisis. One of the reasons inflation is so high is labour shortages, which are in part a symptom of the fact that Russia is struggling with low birth rates and an ageing population. The war in Ukraine has already exacerbated this problem, and another war would make things even worse. Perhaps the one big caveat here is that the war has forced huge changes on Russia's economy. As a result of incredibly high defense spending, Russia's military-industrial base has become spread across the wider economy, and the private sector is also playing a greater role in defense. Russia's beefed-up defense industrial capacity, that would have to be wound down if Russia transitioned back to a peacetime economy, gives Russia an incentive to start a war sooner rather than later, while the war machine is still running and Europe is yet to move to a war footing. But what could happen next weighs a lot on how the war in Ukraine will end, but actually following along with news like this is pretty difficult in the current landscape. We're increasingly being flooded by misleading content, algorithmic feeds that just back up our biases and reductions in fact-checking efforts. It almost feels like people are intentionally making it harder to get to the truth. One way you can cut through that noise is with Ground News, a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, here's a story about US and Russian officials beginning the high-stakes peace talks without Ukraine. Right away, you can see that this story had at least 82 outlets reporting on it, and 44% lean left, while 24% lean right. Every story also comes with a detailed view of the bias distribution, factuality scores, and even specific ownership information, so you can see how reliable the reporting actually is. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to reveal that the left was more likely than the right to express concern over European governments being excluded from the negotiations. But my favourite part has to be their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being underreported on one side of the political spectrum or the other. This not only helps you redress your personal news bias by reading stories you might otherwise have missed, but it also gives you a better perspective of how the media ecosystem is being manipulated and shifted to fit political objectives. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, cutting through the opinion and the noise with a feed free from manipulation or algorithms, and I can't recommend it enough. In fact, if you subscribe today, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's under $6 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.